They called it the Red Ball Express, a lifeline of supplies, ammunition, and fuel that kept the Allied advance across France alive in the summer of 1944. Behind the wheels of those endless convoys of trucks, pushing through day and night along roads marked with red balls, were thousands of young men who had been told their entire lives they weren't good enough to fight on the front lines. Men with dark skin who drove into danger wearing the uniform of a country that refused to treat them as equals. Paris had suffered under Nazi occupation for over 4 years. Its people had endured humiliation, hunger, and fear. Now, as Allied forces pushed eastward across France following the success of D-Day, liberation was within reach. But the story of how Black American soldiers experienced this historic moment and the bittersweet triumph that followed has largely been erased from our collective memory of World War II, August 1944. The air was electric with anticipation. As word spread through Paris that Allied forces were approaching the city, for the French resistance fighters who had been waging their shadow war against Nazi occupiers, the moment to rise up had arrived. For the German garrison, led by General Dietrich von Chaltitz, the question was whether to follow Hitler's orders to destroy Paris rather than surrender it. While French and American military commanders negotiated who would officially liberate the city, a political calculation as much as a military one, the Black American soldiers of transportation and supply units were already playing a crucial role that would never be fully acknowledged in the history books. Private First Class Marcus Johnson wiped sweat from his brow as he guided his truck through the narrow French countryside roads. At just 20 years old, the young man from Mississippi had already seen more of the world than he ever imagined possible. Like thousands of other Black Americans, he had been assigned to the Quartermaster Corps rather than combat units, tasked with the vital but unglamorous job of keeping supplies moving to the front. "Keep 'em rolling," his sergeant would shout as their convoy set out each morning. And roll they did, sometimes for 20 hours straight, catching sleep in snatched moments at the wheel while their partners took over, pushing themselves beyond exhaustion to keep the Allied advance moving forward. The Red Ball Express, with its nearly 6,000 trucks and over 23,000 drivers, 75% of whom were African American, moved more than 12,000 tons of supplies daily. Without them, the lightning advance across France would have been impossible. The tanks needed fuel, the soldiers needed ammunition, the wounded needed medicine, and the black drivers of the Red Ball Express delivered it all, often under enemy fire and always under punishing conditions. What made their service all the more remarkable was that these men were fighting 2 wars at once, against fascism abroad and racism at home. They had left an America where they couldn't sit at the same lunch counter as their white counterparts, where they were forced to use separate water fountains, where they were routinely denied the most basic rights of citizenship. Yet here they were, risking their lives for the freedom of others. "We believed in something bigger than ourselves," Johnson would later tell his grandchildren. "We believed in freedom, even when our own country denied it to us." As Johnson's convoy approached the outskirts of Paris in late August, they began to notice a change in the atmosphere. French civilians lined the roads, waving tricolor flags that had been hidden away for years. Old men with tears streaming down their wrinkled faces stood alongside women clutching children to their chests. "Vive l'Amérique," they shouted. "Vive la liberté." For many of these Black American soldiers, it was the first time they had been greeted not as second-class citizens but as heroes. The French didn't see the color of their skin, they saw liberators, men who had crossed an ocean to free them from tyranny. As Johnson's truck rolled to a stop at a checkpoint on the city's edge, a young French woman with dark hair and bright eyes approached him. She carried a bottle of wine and a single white flower. Without hesitation, she reached up and handed Johnson the flower, then stood on tiptoes to kiss him on both cheeks. "Merci," she said simply, her eyes shining with tears. "Merci pour notre liberté, Johnson." Stunned by this simple act of gratitude and humanity, could only nod in response as emotion tightened his throat. It was a moment of dignity that America had rarely afforded him. But the official liberation of Paris would be carefully choreographed to present a specific image to the world. When General Dwight D. Eisenhower agreed to French General Charles de Gaulle's request that French forces be allowed to liberate their own capital, there was a condition attached. The unit selected, the French 2nd Armored Division, was to be composed entirely of white soldiers. This was made explicit in a memo from Eisenhower's Chief of Staff, Major General Walter Bedell Smith, who wrote, "It is most desirable that the division mentioned above consist of white personnel." Despite the fact that the Free French forces were largely composed of soldiers from France's African colonies who had fought valiantly throughout the war, They were deliberately excluded from the triumphant entry into Paris. Similarly, Black American soldiers were kept from participating in the victory parades and official liberation ceremonies. The Allied command wanted the liberation to be seen as a triumph of white heroism, a narrative that fit neatly with the racist ideologies of the time. Yet the reality on the ground was far more complex. While official photographs and newsreels showed white soldiers being greeted by joyous Parisians, Black American troops were experiencing their own profound moments of connection with the French people, moments that would change their understanding of what was possible in a world without Jim Crow laws. Sergeant William Armstrong of the 761st Tank Battalion, known as the Black Panthers, found himself in a small Parisian cafe on the evening after the city's liberation. The 761st was one of the few black combat units in the segregated U.S. Army, and they had fought with distinction across Europe, even earning praise from General Patton, who had initially doubted their abilities. Armstrong had been granted a rare few hours of leave, and as he sat at a small table nursing a glass of wine, an elderly Frenchman approached him. With halting English, the man asked if Armstrong would join him and his family for dinner in celebration of their freedom. In America, this would never happen, Armstrong thought as he followed the man home, where he was greeted like family by 3 generations of Parisians. They shared their meager rations with him, brought out hidden bottles of champagne that had been saved for this very moment, and asked him about his home, his family, his dreams for after the war. What struck Armstrong most was not just their gratitude, but the complete absence of the color barrier that had defined his entire life in America. Here in this humble Parisian apartment, he was seen first as a man, as a liberator, as a hero, not as a color. This is what we're fighting for, Armstrong realized. Not just to defeat Hitler, but for a world where people are judged by their character, not their skin. For the black soldiers who experienced such moments, Paris became a glimpse of what freedom might truly mean. It planted seeds that would later grow into the civil rights movement back home. If they could be treated with dignity in France, why not in America? If they could fight and die for democracy abroad, why were they denied its basic promises at home? The contrast was particularly stark when it came to relations between black American soldiers and French women. In America, even looking at a white woman could get a black man lynched. In France, relationships across racial lines were common and accepted. For many black soldiers, this was perhaps the most revolutionary aspect of their time in Europe. The simple recognition of their humanity and masculinity. Private Johnson found himself invited to a celebration in a small apartment near the Seine. The family had somehow procured food and wine, and as night fell over the newly liberated city, they danced to records of jazz music that, ironically, had its roots in black American culture, but which had been banned as degenerate under Nazi rule. A young French woman named Marguerite asked Johnson to dance. As they moved together in the cramped living room, she asked him about America. How did he live? What was his home like? Would he return to Paris someday? Johnson found himself unable to describe the reality of segregated America, the humiliation, the constant fear, the barriers that hemmed in his existence from every side. How could he explain that the country he was fighting for wouldn't allow him to vote in many states, to attend the same schools as whites, to dream the same dreams? America is ... complicated, he finally said. Not like here. Marguerite seemed to understand something of what he couldn't say. When this war is over, she told him, the world must change. For all of us, as ... single quotes, for men like Johnson and Armstrong. These experiences in Paris would become touchstones, memories they would carry back to an America that was not ready to change. They had been transformed by their time in Europe, by the dignity they had been afforded, by the glimpse of what equality might feel like. But as the war moved eastward toward Germany, the black soldiers of service units like the Red Ball Express continued their crucial work largely out of the spotlight. Their contributions would be minimized in official histories, their experiences overshadowed by narratives that centered white heroism. The Red Ball Express officially ended operations on November 16, 1944, when the port of Antwerp was finally secured, allowing for shorter supply lines. In just 82 days, they had delivered over 412,000 tons of supplies, playing an essential role in the Allied victory. But their story, like so many involving black contributions to American military success, would be footnoted rather than centered. For George Stuyvesant, a black resistance fighter from what is now Gabon, the liberation of Paris should have been his moment of triumph. Having escaped from a German prisoner of war camp, he had joined the French resistance and fought bravely during the uprising in Paris. Photographs show him standing atop captured German tanks, the very image of victory. But during the official liberation celebrations, as General de Gaulle marched triumphantly down the Champs-Élysées, Duxon, who had been walking near the general, was suddenly removed from the procession at gunpoint. His crime? Being black in a moment that was being carefully choreographed for a white audience. The whitewashing of the liberation extended to the French forces as well. The Free French Army, which had fought its way from Africa to France, was composed largely of soldiers from France's colonies, Senegalese, Moroccans, Algerians. Yet, when it came time to select which French unit would lead the liberation of Paris, the 2nd Armored Division was chosen specifically because it had the highest percentage of white troops. Even then, there weren't enough white French soldiers to fill the ranks. The solution? Light-skinned Syrians, Lebanese, and Algerians who could pass were included, while darker-skinned colonial troops who had fought and died for France from the beginning were sidelined. The message was clear. Liberation was to be white in the official narrative, regardless of the reality on the ground. For the black American soldiers who witnessed this erasure in real time, it was a bitter reminder of the limits of the freedom they were fighting for. Yet the connections they had formed with ordinary French people, the moments of genuine human recognition and gratitude, could not be erased. In the decades that followed, many black veterans would speak of their time in France as transformative. For some, like jazz musician Miles Davis, it would later inspire returns to Paris where they could experience life beyond the crushing weight of American racism. For others, it strengthened their resolve to fight for change back home. When Private Johnson returned to Mississippi after the war, he found a country unchanged in its treatment of black citizens. The GI Bill, which helped millions of white veterans attend college and buy homes, was largely denied to black veterans through discriminatory implementation. The same restaurants that welcomed German prisoners of war refused to serve black American soldiers in uniform. But Johnson carried with him the memory of that young Frenchwoman's simple act of humanity, the gift of a flower, a kiss on the cheek, and the recognition of his dignity as a man and as a liberator. It was a small moment, invisible to history's grand narrative, yet it contained the seed of a revolution. I had seen another world. Johnson would later tell the young people in his community as they began organizing for civil rights. I had seen what was possible. The Wwii campaign, Victory Against Fascism Abroad and Racism at Home, had been the rallying cry for black Americans during the war. The first V had been achieved with the defeat of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. The second would require another kind of struggle, one that was already beginning as veterans like Johnson returned with new perspectives and heightened determination. When Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat in 1955, when students sat in at lunch counters in 1960, when marchers crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge in 1965, they were carrying forward the unfinished business of those black soldiers who had experienced freedom in the streets of Paris only to return to oppression at home. The full story of black Americans' role in the liberation of Europe has only recently begun to receive the attention it deserves. The Red Ball Express, the 761st Tank Battalion, the 92nd Infantry Division, the Tuskegee Airmen all made crucial contributions to victory in World War II, despite serving in a segregated military that doubted their courage and abilities. Their experiences in places like Paris, where they were welcomed as liberators regardless of their skin color, planted seeds of change that would bear fruit in the civil rights movement. The contrast between how they were treated abroad and at home made the injustice of American segregation all the more stark and untenable. As Johnson's truck rolled out of Paris in late August 1944, continuing east with the Allied advance, he took one last look at the Eiffel Tower silhouetted against the evening sky, the tricolor flag once again flying proudly from its summit. He thought of Marguerite's words, "When this war is over, the world must change." It would be decades before that change would fully come. And in many ways the struggle continues to this day. But in that moment in Paris, as black American soldiers were embraced by the people they had helped liberate, the possibility of a different world had been glimpsed, a world where the color of one's skin did not determine the content of one's humanity. The crowds that welcomed black soldiers into Paris didn't just make history in that moment. They helped plant the seeds for a revolution of consciousness that would transform America in the decades to come. Though official histories attempted to erase their presence, the truth remains. Black soldiers entered Paris as liberators, and in that role they experienced a freedom that would inspire them to demand no less when they returned home. The irony was painful yet profound. In America, these men had been relegated to support roles, denied the opportunity to prove themselves in combat despite their willingness to serve. The military leadership believed that black soldiers lacked the courage and ability to fight effectively. Yet without the tireless efforts of the black soldiers of the Red Ball Express, The Allied advance that liberated Paris and pushed toward Germany would have stalled for lack of supplies. Corporal James Robinson of the 3916th Quartermaster Truck Company remembered the punishing schedule and dangerous conditions they faced. "We drove day and night, sometimes 20 hours straight," he recalled years later. German planes would strafe the roads. We'd hear the whistle of bombs or the crack of sniper fire. But we kept going because we knew that men at the front were counting on us. Robinson, like many of his fellow drivers, had never even been allowed to drive a car back in his hometown in Georgia. There, black men weren't trusted with vehicles, weren't permitted to obtain licenses in many cases. Yet here, in the crucible of war, he was responsible for tons of vital supplies, navigating unfamiliar roads in a foreign country, often at night with only the dimmest of cat-eye headlights to avoid detection by enemy aircraft. The transformation of these men from second-class citizens to essential warriors occurred not just on the roads of France, but in the hearts and minds of the black soldiers themselves. They had been told their whole lives what they couldn't do, where they couldn't go, who they couldn't be. Now they were proving those limitations false with every mile they drove, every ton of supplies they delivered, every obstacle they overcame. As the Red Ball Express trucks rumbled through the liberated areas of France in the weeks after D-Day, they witnessed scenes of jubilation that would stay with them forever. French civilians would rush to the roadsides, offering wine, bread, cheese, whatever meager provisions they could share with their liberators. For Staff Sergeant Chester Jones of the 3418th Trucking Company, one such encounter outside a small village near Chartres stood out in his memory. An elderly Frenchman with tears streaming down his weathered face stood at attention and saluted as Jones's convoy passed. Beside him, 3 generations of his family, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, waved small American flags. Later, when Jones's truck developed mechanical problems and he had to stop for repairs, that same family insisted he come to their home while his partner worked on the vehicle. There, in their modest farmhouse, they treated him like royalty, serving him the best of their limited food and bringing out precious heirlooms to show him. "I don't speak much English," the old man said through his grandson's halting translation, "but I know what freedom means. You have brought it back to us." Jones, who had grown up in Alabama under the shadow of Jim Crow, had never experienced such respect from white people. The simplicity of being treated as a human being, as a hero rather than a threat, was revolutionary. For many black soldiers, these encounters with the French were their first experience of what equality might feel like. It created a cognitive dissonance that they would carry back to America, the knowledge that another way of living was possible, that the racism they had experienced their entire lives was neither natural nor inevitable. The full impact of these experiences wouldn't be fully understood until years later, when veterans of the European theater returned home and began to question why they should accept second-class citizenship in the country they had fought to defend. As the Allies pushed toward Paris in August 1944, the black drivers of the Red Ball Express found themselves at the center of one of the war's most dramatic moments. The liberation of Paris was not just a military objective, but a powerful symbol, the reclaiming of one of the world's great cultural centers from Nazi control. For Private Johnson, entering the outskirts of Paris felt like crossing into a dream. The City of Light had featured in stories and films a place of romance and culture that seemed as distant as the moon to a young man from rural Mississippi. Now he was here, part of the force that would return this jewel to the French people. What Johnson and his fellow black soldiers couldn't know was that even as they played their essential role in the liberation, plans were already underway to erase them from the official narrative. The images that would be broadcast to the world, the photographs that would appear in newspapers and magazines, the newsreels that would play in theaters across America, all would present a whitewashed version of the liberation, one in which black faces were conspicuously absent. This erasure wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate choice made by military and political leaders who understood the power of imagery in shaping public perception. The liberation of Paris was to be a triumphant moment in the Allied narrative, and in the Jim Crow era, triumph was coded as white. Yet despite this official erasure, black soldiers found their own moments of triumph in the streets of Paris. As Johnson's supply convoy made its way through the city, Parisians lined the streets, throwing flowers, offering wine, reaching out to touch the hands of their liberators. An older woman with silver hair broke through the crowd and approached Johnson's truck as it idled at an intersection. She carried a small package wrapped in newspaper. With tears in her eyes, she pressed it into Johnson's hands. "Pour vous," she said. "For you." Later, when Johnson unwrapped the package, he found a silver pocket watch. Inside was inscribed, A Notre Liberateur, avec gratitude eternal to our liberator with eternal gratitude. It was perhaps the most valuable possession this woman owned, and she had given it freely to a young black man from Mississippi whom she saw not as a color but as a savior. Such moments occurred throughout Paris in those heady days of liberation. Black soldiers, whether from transport units, engineering corps, or the few combat units like the 761st Tank Battalion, found themselves embraced by the French in ways they had never experienced at home. For many it was in Paris that they first danced with white women without fear of reprisal, first dined in restaurants as honored guests rather than servants, first walked down streets with their heads held high, meeting the eyes of those they passed without the need to step aside or lower their gaze. Lieutenant James Peterson of the 784th Tank Battalion remembered walking into the Café de la Paix on the day after liberation. The elegant establishment fell silent as he entered, still in his dusty uniform. For a moment he feared the worst, that he had transgressed some boundary, that he would be asked to leave. Then the entire café rose to their feet and applauded. The maître d' escorted him to the best table in the house. Strangers sent over bottles of champagne. A famous French actress kissed his cheek and thanked him for France's freedom. In that moment, Peterson later wrote, I understood what it meant to be not just a soldier, but a man fully recognized for his humanity. For black soldiers like Peterson, Johnson, Armstrong, and countless others whose names have been lost to history, these experiences in Paris created a template for what might be possible. They had seen a world beyond segregation, beyond the artificial hierarchies of race that had constrained their lives in America. This glimpse of possibility would fuel the civil rights struggles to come. Many of the early leaders of civil rights organizations were veterans who had experienced this alternative vision of society during their time in Europe. They returned home with not just a desire for change, but a concrete understanding that change was possible because they had lived it. However briefly, in places like Paris. The cruel irony was that even as they were being embraced as liberators by the French, black American soldiers remained second-class citizens in their own army. They ate in segregated mess halls, slept in segregated barracks, served in segregated units. The very military that had brought them to France to fight for freedom maintained its own rigid system of racial separation. This contradiction was not lost on the French, many of whom expressed bewilderment at the American policy of segregation. French civilians would invite black and white soldiers to the same celebrations only to watch in confusion as white officers insisted they couldn't attend the same functions. For Corporal Ernest Myers of the 3214th Quartermaster Service Company, one such incident stood out in his memory. After delivering supplies to a unit stationed near Paris, he and his driving partner were invited to a celebration in a local café. When they arrived, they found both black and white American soldiers mingling with French civilians. A white lieutenant from the South ordered Myers and the other black soldiers to leave, claiming the café was for whites only. The French owner, outraged, insisted that all liberators were welcome in his establishment. When the lieutenant threatened to declare the café off-limits to all American personnel, the owner replied that perhaps then only the Germans would have been preferable customers, as they at least didn't discriminate among those they oppressed. Shamed but unmoved, the lieutenant and several white soldiers left. The remaining white soldiers, the black soldiers, and their French hosts, continued the celebration, a small victory for humanity in the midst of war. Such incidents revealed the absurdity of American racism when transplanted to foreign soil. They also created cracks in the edifice of segregation that would eventually help bring the whole structure down. As the initial euphoria of liberation gave way to the realities of a war still to be won, the black soldiers of support units like the Red Ball Express continued their vital but unglamorous work. They moved supplies from the beaches of Normandy to the front lines, fueling the Allied advance toward Germany. The work was exhausting and dangerous. German aircraft still controlled much of the sky, and the roads were vulnerable to ambush. The trucks themselves were pushed to their mechanical limits, breaking down frequently under the strain of constant use. For the drivers, the physical challenges were matched by emotional ones. They were caught between the exhilaration of contributing to the liberation of Europe and the frustration of remaining second-class citizens in the very army they served. Private Johnson captured this contradiction in a letter home in September 1944. "The French treat us like heroes," he wrote. "They don't see color, only the uniform, only that we are Americans who have come to help them. If only our own people could see us the same way." This sentiment echoed throughout the ranks of black soldiers serving in Europe. They had crossed an ocean to fight for freedom, yet they themselves were not free. They liberated nations while their own communities remained bound by legal segregation and extra-legal violence. Yet despite this bitter paradox, many black soldiers found a sense of purpose and pride in their service. They were proving through their actions what no amount of argument could establish, that they were equal in courage and capability and humanity. As the Allied forces pushed eastward in the months following the liberation of Paris, the lessons learned by black soldiers in those heady days of August 1944 remained. They had seen another way of living, another way of being seen. They had experienced, however briefly, the dignity that should have been their birthright. When Private Johnson finally returned to Mississippi in 1946, he carried with him not just medals and memories, but a quiet determination that things must change. The woman who had given him the flower and kissed his cheek. The elderly man who had saluted him with tears in his eyes. The French families who had welcomed him into their homes. They had shown him a glimpse of what America could be if it lived up to its highest ideals. Johnson would go on to become a teacher in his hometown, quietly working for change in his community. He wasn't a famous civil rights leader whose name would appear in history books, but he was one of thousands of black veterans whose experiences abroad transformed how they saw themselves and their country. The story of black soldiers in Paris is not just about what happened in those few days of liberation in August 1944. It's about how those experiences reverberated through the decades that followed, how they helped fuel a movement that would eventually transform America itself. When we look at the iconic images of the liberation of Paris, the joyous crowds, the flowers thrown to soldiers, the kisses exchanged with grateful civilians, we should remember that among those liberators were thousands of black Americans whose contributions have been systematically erased from our collective memory. Their stories deserve to be told not just as footnotes, but as central to understanding both the war itself and its long aftermath. The black soldiers who entered Paris as liberators experienced a freedom there that they would spend the rest of their lives fighting to secure at home. In this way, the seeds of the civil rights movement were planted not just in the soil of American injustice, but in the streets of a liberated Paris, where black men were, for perhaps the first time in their lives, seen simply as men, as heroes, as liberators, as equals. The crowd didn't just welcome them, they embraced them in a way that transcended the artificial boundaries of race. And in doing so, they showed these soldiers a vision of what America itself might one day become. If this story moved you, please take a second to like this video. It truly helps us keep these untold stories alive. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to discover more real stories of black heroes whose courage changed the course of history.